The Open University of Hong Kong's Institute of International Business and Governance held a research seminar on contemporary developments in global management. The speaker was Professor Ken Kamoche from Nottingham University Business School in the United Kingdom. Professor Kamoche discusses the challenges of talent management in a globalized context and shares his research findings on a study he conducted based on the experiences of management trainees in Hong Kong.
The topic I'm going to speak to you about today, globalization, is one that is actually very close to my heart. Globalization and talent management. But in many ways, I see myself as somebody who is a product of the global world. I was born in Kenya, raised in Kenya, worked in the UK, and have worked here in Hong Kong. So in a way, I don't know whether you would say I have an identity crisis or whether I have three identities, which I think is, in a way, is an interesting way to begin a discussion on globalization. Although I'm not going to be talking too much about globalization per se. I'm going to be talking about globalization as it relates to talent management, and I'll focus on the talent management issues, which I think are very pivotal to business success today. So locating the talent management debate within a global context is essentially what I'm going to be focusing on today. So I think it's worth just beginning by giving you a broad overview of what it is that we mean by globalization. And I think you'll be familiar with some of these issues. It's all about the integration of nations and economies. There are issues to do with changes in the societies that we live in, the economy, industrialization, and in fact, issues like politics, where the world is so heavily interconnected today, politically. Political changes taking place in one part of the world having an immediate impact on another part of the world. It's about the environment and how, for example, environmental change will impact economies and peoples somewhere else. So we cannot escape these realities. And what we see here is a really broad picture. We can break it down to much more specific categories. If you look around here, you've got things like the integration of economies, communication and IT. I'm not going to go through all of them. Perhaps I'll highlight one or two, like, for example, technology and the role of the internet, which, as you know, has become quite pivotal in everyday life. We see things like the shrinking world. We talk about the world being a global village. It's a term that's been in use for a couple of decades now, and we can begin to see the realities of that through, for example, the movements of people. We have issues like poverty, because it's not exactly an equal world. The impact of globalization also reveals the inequalities, both across nations and also in specific societies themselves. So this is really just a very broad overview of some of the issues that have relevance to the globalization debate. So some of the other issues that are worth highlighting when we talk about globalization: the question of international competition, competitiveness as well, the drive for efficiency with multinational firms operating across borders, industrial restructuring. There was a time when we thought of industry as manufacturing, but we begin to see a shift, or we've begun to see a shift in the last 15, 20 years towards services. Whereas, of course, manufacturing is still very pivotal. Countries like the UK find that there's not very much that is made there physically today. It's all about services, all about banking and insurance. It's all about customer services. You ring up to ask questions about your account. You ring up to ask questions about the provision of some service. The actual manufacture or making of goods being shifted away to other economies. Of course, we've seen that very much with the case of China, the world's factory. So these shifts are felt and are seen across the nations. In Africa, where I come from, the economy is still very dependent on raw materials, production and commodities, and mining, agriculture, very important. But that is also beginning to change now, because the impact of ICT and technology is opening up the economies and allowing people opportunities to actually provide services. It's allowing people who are computer savvy to make that leap into the internet era. Now, a very important aspect of globalization, which leads me now to the emphasis on my presentation, is the movement of people. Because what we have seen in recent years with movement of people, particularly from areas where there is strife, uncertainties, instability, fighting, and moving towards places where people will be seeking a safe haven. I'll be saying a little bit more about that. But let me just make the point here that globalization, although we talk about it being a wonderful thing, it opens up economies, it frees up resources, it creates opportunities right across the board, but it is not always a rosy picture, as we see here. In fact, one of the challenges with globalization today is how it forces emerging economies to open up to foreign products, where multinational firms or traders would be dumping products. So economies, for example, the ones in Africa, often do complain that they're forced to open up, they're forced to be part of this global debate, and yet they find that the Western markets are closed to their products. So there's that uncertainty, there's that issue of unfairness, and often that is associated with resistance. So the Africans will be saying, why are we being forced to import products from the West, whereas when we want to export our coffee, our manufactured products, we come up against all these tariffs. There's a huge debate about that. WTO has also been subject to resistance in various parts of the world. So it's worth bearing in mind both the negatives as well as the positives, and not to talk up the positives. There are changes ahead and challenges ahead. Now, what we see here is the reality that we have witnessed with people escaping from, in particular, Syria. Sometime towards the middle of last year, mass exodus of people from North Africa. In fact, from as far south as Eritrea, making their way across the Sahara Desert towards Europe. Now, Europe presents a very interesting challenge because Europe is often seen as a land of opportunity. But obviously, there are very serious immigration concerns. The barriers have been raised to the extent that Europe is often seen as a fortress. Now, the irony here is that European countries can put up barriers to prevent legitimate immigrants who have skills to offer, and yet because of the uncertainties and turbulence in the Middle East, in Syria, they have to contend with this exodus. On humanitarian grounds, you have to let these people in, you have to let the people in. You can't let them perish at sea. But obviously, in the majority of cases, there is not very much in the way of expertise and skills that these immigrants are able to offer. So it's a paradox there that Europe is having to contend with. And the challenge, I think, in this particular context is the fact that you still need to find some way to attract talent. You still need to find some way to motivate people. You still need to find some way to retain the best. So the debate on the management of people, and in particular the management of talent, carries on in spite of these realities. I thought it's worth giving you a fairly broad overview of some of the employers, the largest employers in the world today. I'm not going to be talking very generally about the management of people, but I thought it's important to highlight two points. One, much of the research that we do as scholars within business schools actually looks at the private sector, private industry. It looks at multinational firms, small and medium-sized enterprises. But in fact, the reality is that some of the largest employers are actually in the public sector. We see here, for example, the US Department of Defense, 3.2 million people. The PLA, 2.3 million people. That's a lot of people. You've got Walmart in third place, doing quite well in terms of size, 2.1 million. And McDonald's also doing quite well. I'm not going to go through the whole of that. But what I really want to highlight is not just the large numbers of employees that some of these organizations have, but some of the challenges that are being faced in the context of globalization. Take, for example, the UK National Health Service, coming down there at about 1.7 million. Now, the NHS is the healthcare provider in the UK, as you probably know. So it's been in existence from some time just after the war, I think 1948 or thereabout. It's always been a very stable, very good provider, very reliable provider of healthcare facilities. Doctors are hired through the NHS, nurses and so forth. But the NHS has been facing some serious difficulties. I don't know how familiar you are with the UK news and perhaps the recent incidents where junior doctors threatening to go on strike and actually went on strike, I think, on one occasion. A very unusual occurrence, never really happened before. So why is it happening now? Why are junior doctors so angry to the point of actually going out in the streets instead of staying in hospital to look after patients? It's a very interesting and intricate problem here because on the one hand, there are concerns about cost cutting, efficient delivery of services. On the other hand, it's about ensuring that you have highly motivated, talented people that you're able to retain. But the UK is in a slightly difficult situation because, like many Western economies, not training sufficient numbers of local personnel. So the medical schools will have local citizens, but also many overseas students that they rely on. So many of the people who are actually qualifying as doctors will end up going overseas. So there is a shortage. There's always a shortage of reliable personnel, a stock of expertise. There's a shortage of nurses. But how do you fill that gap when you're putting up immigration barriers? And therein lies the challenge. You need people, but you haven't got them locally. You've got to find them from somewhere else. And yet you're making it very difficult for people from somewhere else to come into the system. So it's not surprising. And I think one of the challenges that the junior doctors are facing in the UK, and perhaps indeed many other places, is just not being able to have a reliable employment status. And you can remain as a junior doctor for a very long period of time. So that gives us a glimpse into some of the challenges that a whole economy might face in terms of attracting, retaining, motivating talented employees. In this debate, I thought it's also worth highlighting a number of factors. This list shows some of the largest firms towards the end of last year. Walmart at the top there, but as you can see, the majority of those firms are actually in the petroleum industry. Now, the challenge, I think, for us is to ask ourselves, what is this picture going to look like towards the end of this year, and perhaps next year, knowing what we know about the crisis that's been taking place in the petroleum industry with oil prices falling? Are we still going to see these very large firms, or are we going to see a bit of a shake-up? And what does that tell us about the employment situation, the management of employees, the retention of individuals? So one example here I'm giving you is the oil industry here, and I think another one here that I thought would be interesting will be the internet market. I think you recognize some of these firms, or most of them anyway. This gives us a comparison of some of the largest IT firms in the world in the last 20 years. So 1995, you can see that Netscape, when many of us started using internet and email and so forth for the first time, Netscape was the biggest operator. 20 years later, it doesn't even show up because it just kind of fizzled away, it died away. Apple has held its own. Any surprises there? One of the best managed and one of the most, I suppose, innovative firms, moving from the second position to the first position. So I think it's a very interesting example of how you can secure success in industry, primarily through talent management, I think, because creativity resides within the people. So this is not so much about the manufacture, but of course they make some of the finest products out there, but it's really down to the skills, talents, and abilities of the individuals who work for that particular firm, and all the rest of these. So if you go down the list, I think you will see that there have been a few changes. Some of the firms have survived. A small number have survived 20 years. Largely US firms in that picture. The third company there, German firm. 20 years later, we don't see any top German firms in the IT industry there. I think the biggest surprise there, I suppose, is China. With Alibaba in operation for the last maybe 17, 18 years, wasn't really in existence 20 years ago, climbing up to third place and becoming a really large player with its listing in the New York Stock Exchange, I believe, last year. Again, that boils down to the way you configure your talent profile as an organization. And I think you can see that there are a couple of Chinese firms, whereas 20 years ago, there were hardly any. So this tells us something a little bit about the shifts, the trends, and what we might expect in the future. Where are we going to see the next major players in the IT sector? And what does that tell us about the shifts in talent? So what has this all got to do with talent? Or where does that take us to? And this is where I want to start now focusing more on the talent management issue, responding to the global HR talent. Now, McKinsey famously announced in 1997 or thereabout that there's a war going on, a war for talent. Right? What kind of a war is this? Is this about firms fighting each other for limited resources? It pretty much boils down to that. I think we know that when it comes to recruitment, we think about employees fighting over places. Graduates, universities churning out graduates who then go out to look for jobs. And they're competing against each other for jobs. But what we realize, especially with the emergence of this talent management notion, is that firms are also competing for employees. Hence the notion that it's a war going on. But what does it actually mean? There's been a lot of confusion about what the term itself implies, what we should make of it. Some people will say that it talks about the high potential employees, senior employees, graduates, and so forth. In a recent study by the Chartered Institute of Personnel Development in the UK, they found that only 20% of firms define all employees as talent, which means the majority actually recognize that it's a scarce resource. They don't believe that everybody is a talent. They believe that it's a small number. Aviva, I think, is an insurance firm, if I'm not wrong. They believe that if you work for this firm, you are talented. If you work for this firm, that automatically guarantees that you have to be good to be here in the first place. And that I think is reassuring for employees who work there. I think if your employer said you are a talent because you're working here, that's reassuring. So for this company, it's a very broad definition, and that goes against the grain. In the majority of cases, firms will think about talent as a very narrow field. That's what we tend to find in industry. So what is talent anyway? Because I think it's important to actually nail this thing down. When we talk about talent, people think about these special skills, particularly in the performing arts. Britain's Got Talent. I don't know, do they have a program like that? Hong Kong's Got Talent? Yeah? Well, it's become a global phenomenon. People showcasing their skills in singing and dancing and doing all kinds of fancy tricks and what have you. So it's very much about the performing arts. But what about in industry? When we talk about talent or talent management at the workplace, what is actually referred to? Now, the one thing to highlight is that this is actually a very global phenomenon. Although the discussion started very much within the West, but we find that, for example, if you do a quick search, Singapore Talent Management Conference, all the way down to Canada, people are asking, businesses asking questions about where are you likely to source talent this year? It's not so much about where are you likely to source your employees. They're actually narrowing it down very specifically to talent. In Africa as well, conferences, workshops, seminars on talent. China and India. So it's pretty much a global phenomenon. And I think one of the questions that we'll be asking is this talent management, is this talent thing replacing the human resource management phenomenon that we're more familiar with? Or is it the same thing? And perhaps we'll find out. So in Hong Kong as well, this is an emerging phenomenon, both in terms of the academic debate, but also at the workplace. So I think for us, Hong Kong is a very interesting case because, as we can see here, talent is in short supply, as it is indeed elsewhere, everywhere. And it cuts across nearly every sector. Now, Hong Kong is an interesting case because there's a brain drain that we saw, particularly marked in the 90s, very much associated with the discussion and the uncertainties leading up to the handover to China, 1997. So apparently, these are not my figures, apparently about 800,000 people left Hong Kong since 1980. Now, of course, many came back. I don't know how many, but still there is a concern that there are many who left and didn't come back, right? So that speaks to this issue of scarcity. Low birth rate also accounts for this scenario, and an aging population. Now, this statement here is actually from a recent Hong Kong government report, which say that a third of the population will be over 65 in 30 years' time, 2045. Does that surprise you? I was surprised. I thought, wow, that's a third of the population. But if you think about 3 people, one person has retired, is just taking it easy, playing golf or mahjong or whatever. And then you've got one person still in education, maybe just starting their job, and only one person is working to support the other 2. I thought that's a pretty scary prospect. So it is actually an issue, and it's one that needs to be addressed. So for us, really, the issue is, what does this actually mean, right? Came across a recent report which states that over 90% of Hong Kong firms are encountering difficulties in finding the right people to fill jobs. So we decided to carry out a study, and at this point I would like to acknowledge the presence of my co-author on the second part of this presentation that I'm going to be working on, Flora, who was my doctoral student. We did this study to look into the talent management situation in Hong Kong. So that's really what I'm going to be devoting the rest of this discussion to give you an overview of what talent management, the talent management context is within Hong Kong. I think our concern is very much about not just understanding what talent management is about, but understanding what talent management is about from the point of view of people who are considered to be talented. Okay? Because much of the literature that we've come across is very much based on a Western perspective. And it talks about managers' views. So we decided to look at the other side of the coin, as it were. Now, I will begin by giving you a fairly broad overview of what the literature actually says. Without boring you with the specific details, it's worth mentioning that there's an emerging literature. So it's not like we are inventing the wheel here. There's been a debate. It doesn't go too far back. As you can see, 2010, about 5-6 years, that's when the debate has really picked up. Of course, there are people who've been writing about talent management and talent going back to about 10 years ago, but not an awful lot. It's a very recent academic phenomenon. But as with every emerging discipline, there are a number of issues which remain unresolved, one of which is about definition. What exactly does it mean? And what do we mean when we talk about talent? I think when we look through the literature, you see there's some common themes. There's an emphasis on potential, high potential. There's an emphasis on people who actually make a difference. We can also think of talent as those individuals who are most adaptable to change, okay? Or people who are gifted, more generally, a very, very general view. We could also think of talent as reflecting the Pygmalion effect. This goes back to, I think, Greek mythology. I think there's a king who had a sculpture or made a sculpture and then fell in love with it. It looks so beautiful. And then, because of the kind of reaction he had to the sculpture, he made it come alive. Now, that's a very interesting idea, that you can actually induce a lifeless form to come into life, which is an interesting metaphor for us, because it says that you can take somebody who is not very skillful and not very skilled or not very talented and turn them into a successful employee. That's an interesting concept, because it suggests that you can not only turn someone who is not very promising into someone who is an exceptional performer, but it also suggests to us that anybody can be described as talented. So there's some confusion, some ambiguity about what this really means. But the important point to note here is that perhaps we think of talent management, but we're actually really saying that if we expect somebody to do well, they will do well. Okay? Maybe this will become clearer as we go down the line. So the next issue about the literature is there is a lot of ambiguity and inconsistency in interpreting the notion. Is it simply another way to describe human resource management? Is it just another name for succession planning? Now, we think there is a difference here. We think that talent management is not just another name for human resource management. We think that because it focuses on high potential people, it begins to indicate a different approach, an elitist approach, where elitist is not necessarily desirable, but it is, by definition, elitist, because it is highlighting the achievements of a small number, and then in the process asking questions or leaving us with questions as to what happens to the rest. If the talent is only 20%, what are we going to do about the other 80%? Should we just let them be? Or should we just expect that that's the way the world is and just not bother? So there are questions about the way talent management is practiced, and I think we'll look at some of those as we go down the line. A final issue with regard to the background literature here is how do we actually determine that talent management is effective? How do we know that these 20% or 15% or whatever it is are actually responsible for the success of the business and its performance? How can we tell that? How do we know that it's actually effective? There's some concern about that because it's not actually easy. You can't use things like return on investment because you can't really specifically measure the output of individuals so directly. You can look at how the processes are actually managed. You can compare how firms perform. So there are some ways to begin to address that debate, but there's still a lot of work to be done. As I mentioned earlier, talent management is very much a Western phenomenon. So most of the firms that have been discussed in the literature will be from the West. But we thought that it's important to look at what's happening elsewhere. And we also thought that it's important to have a more pluralistic picture by not always talking about what the managers say, but by hearing the voices of those people who are considered to be talent. In terms of theory development, an emerging field has not really had this much scope to develop theoretically. And we are suggesting that the resource-based view might be one way to go about this issue. I will not dwell too much on the question of the resource-based view. This is a theory that goes back to strategic management as far back to, I think, the 80s, where the argument really very much was about the fact that organizations are successful because of the resources that they have. And those resources would deliver value if they are scarce, if they're rare, if they're difficult to imitate. So if you have a very unique set of individuals, and those individuals are applied in a very meaningful way to the challenges of the organization, they'll be successful. The company will be successful. So the idea is that you're not necessarily successful because of things that are happening outside, but because of what you have within. I think that's a very important point to make. So without going into a lot of that detail, that's really something worth highlighting. So we're suggesting, therefore, that perhaps talent can be a strategic resource, because talent, by definition, is rare, right? Not everyone is going to be considered a top performer. It is reasonably difficult to imitate, and individuals who are considered talented will therefore be in a position to impact performance. And the other thing we expect is that talented individuals will be distinguishable from others in terms of their expectations, right? And I think we see that not just in industry, not just at the workplace, but in other fields as well. For example, in sports, if you look at football, or basketball, or any of the major sports, if you look at the people who are really very special, the top performers, they also tend to be very demanding, right? They probably don't want to show up for training, and maybe the manager cannot do very much about it, unless you are Ferguson and you can kick a boot and hit the guy's face. But many of these top performers find that they can exercise a lot of leeway. It's almost like they can have rules made for themselves, right? They operate on a different set of rules. They're very demanding. So this is one thing that we expect could be potentially problematic. We will also be arguing that talent management can serve as an organizational or human resource capability. Now, this again goes back to the idea that the resource-based view is not just about having special resources, but also about having some way to drive those resources, to have the right capabilities in order that the real potential of the resources can be realized. So it's not good having very good people, but not having the mechanism for managing them so that they can deliver. You've got to have both. So a good talent management approach will be a very effective way to achieve this. We think that senior management can play a significant role in orchestrating that process. And if we divide this talent management process into three, then that begins to help us to narrow it down. So we will be saying that the first part will be to identify the talent, which you can do through the basic human resource management practices such as recruitment and selection. But you'll be looking more specifically at those people who have high potential, not just people who appear to fit into the job, right? You'll be looking at ways in which you can motivate them because they have certain expectations, certain needs, certain perceptions of themselves, who they are. You'll be finding some way to retain them, right? Because talented people are, by definition, fairly mobile. They're more likely to walk out of the door if they're not satisfied, because they have opportunities out there. If you're an average performer, then you might find it difficult to find alternative employment. If you're considered talented and you're very good, whether it's in sports, if you're not happy with the club, there'll be another 5-10 clubs looking out for you, right? So that creates a real challenge for retention for the talented individuals. So what I'm going to do now is give you an overview of the study that we carried out, some thoughts on methodology, a qualitative inductive study which sought to hear the voices of a set of individuals based on their own experiences. Right, so we took an approach that sought to generate theory rather than to test it. We're guided by the question, what's the main story here? What's really happening here? What is the experience of these individuals? Using semi-structured interviews, talked to 22 management trainees from 9 companies here in Hong Kong. And some 8 executives, because we also wanted to hear the voices of the organization. What do the managers actually say? What do they think they're trying to achieve with a talent management approach? By having management trainees as part of a talent management process, what is it they're trying to achieve? How do they define the needs of the organization? And this gives you a broad sort of summary of those individuals. You can see that the managers were from 2 line managers, 3 HR managers, and then 3 managers from learning and development, like training and so forth. And they came from a whole range of different industries here, from property, the main industries, the main sectors, if you like, in Hong Kong: hotel, engineering, transport, banking and finance, and so forth. I'm going to give you an overview of the key themes that we found that help to shed light on the research question. The first one is there's a certain distinctiveness of this group of management trainees who are considered talent. Elite group, an important word here, because they have these very unique expectations. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll also talk about the issue of value. Now, value comes through quite forcefully in a number of areas. First of all, in the way that people see themselves contributing value to the organization, seeing themselves as useful and being seen by their managers as useful, but also how they themselves acquire value in order to enhance their own employability and so forth. And finally, I'll look at the way you bring together these people, the practices, and policies. Just starting with the first point there, this elite group with unique expectations. One thing that was very interesting was this perception of the caring family, right? We tend to think of high achievers as fairly aggressive people who only care about their own achievement. But we were surprised to discover that many of these employees, who are fairly young people, were actually quite highly motivated by the idea of a caring family. And if you see some of the quotes we have here, the company gives me a very different impression from other different companies. It shows me a very special type of care and attitude. The personnel is warm, makes you feel warm inside. You can imagine this person going, oh, I feel warm, I feel really happy, internally happy to be in this kind of organization. This company, I chose this company because I got the impression, I really feel it's like a family rather than a job. I just wonder, do these comments surprise you? Do you think that your graduates, when they leave here, they go into a job and they feel, oh, this is like a real family? Well, that's what these people are saying, which is kind of surprising. It was also about being the center of attention. I haven't got the time to show you a lot of these quotes, but people were talking about how they felt they wanted to be recognized, which is not really surprising. They wanted management to pay attention to them and what they were doing, what they were able to offer. If they made a mistake, they wanted a second chance. They didn't want to be penalized. They wanted to feel that this notion of a family continued, long after the management trainee program had ended. So wanting to secure this kind of uniqueness over a period of time. But I'm special. I'm not just special for these 2 years. I'm going to be special until I become a manager, a director. That carrying on for quite a while. And you can imagine how this then impacts on expectations with regard to pay, career advancement, and so forth. So you're setting these people on a track where they're always going to be very demanding. Now, that is not really well recognized in the literature. We can summarize some of these by looking at the expectations with regard to the particular phase. So in the initial phases, people will be looking for learning opportunities. They want opportunities to acquire more knowledge, which obviously means enhancing your abilities, employability, and so forth. Quicker promotion. And these are also the motivators. These are the things that actually keep them there. Then you have the development phase or middle phases where they're in the early stage of their career. So they want learning, but they also want growth. They want to see growth taking place. And this is where a lot of these, the whole family notion comes into the picture. They're not all that motivated by pay, but pay is obviously important. In fact, we saw, and I think we'll see later, that people are prepared to forego high pay in the first instance if it means consolidating your position as a top performer and then seeking higher pay later on. Now I go to the question of value. What does it mean to be valued? Wanting a sense of commitment. So you find people saying things like they hope they can make a contribution. They hope that they can be associated with something that was successful, that they can look back and say, yeah, that product, I was involved in making that product. I was involved in building, in providing that service. It strengthens your sense of identity as an achiever. Okay, so you're not just there as an employee, just doing your day-to-day work. No, you'd like some recognition that you are a part of something successful. It's about being valued. Okay, I want to stay in this company as I see as important, and I need more challenge to prove my ability. In fact, one of the other things, I don't know if it comes up later, is how some individuals were saying, I turned down a job because they did not give me enough opportunity to demonstrate what I can actually do. Mentoring was an interesting aspect here because many of these people had a mentor. But I think what we're finding is that the mentoring approach within Hong Kong firms does not quite deliver, because you often find young people complaining that my mentor was much older than me. It's like my father's age. There's not much we can talk about. Maybe if there was a shorter gap, maybe it's easier to talk. But if the person is so old, you feel like, okay, we sit in a meeting. Yeah, okay. How is the work going? It's okay. Yeah, everything fine? Yeah, okay. All the best. See you later. It's not really helpful. You need to be able to establish a proper dialogue. Otherwise, it becomes a wasted opportunity. And the third point here, when you look at the interplay or the integration of these processes and what have you. Let's look first at the people. The supervisors were an important part of the whole process, well involved. Middle management had a potential role to play. Communication with middle management, they need to understand the company's expectations. So these are people saying there wasn't always a clear understanding from management, especially from the top management, about what the role was for these talented people. There needs to be a better understanding that we're bringing people on this fast track. You really need to be prepared for the expectations they have. Meet those expectations because it's a mutual thing. The commitment is a mutual process. When it came to, say, assessment of potential, even right down to the early phases of recruitment, many of these firms had a tendency to just use off-the-shelf assessment tools. I think it's a very common thing. You apply for a job, they set you some tests, and everybody knows the answers to these tests because they are available to everybody. So what are you really testing? What are you really learning from those particular tests? It makes more sense to design something that is more firm-specific. The processes, these examples that I mentioned earlier, where somebody says of a particular company, I don't like their interview arrangement, or they give me an offer too early, they don't see the whole of me. That's a bit strange in a way, isn't it? Because you'd expect that if you're going for job interviews, you don't want to spend all your time going to interviews. As much as possible, you like to be able to get the first job that you come across. You don't want to be told, okay, that's not good, so you go out and apply for another one. I think a lot of young people looking for a job will be happy to take on a job that comes. But these people are saying, no, they made me an offer. It's a good company, but I don't actually want to work there because everything happened too fast. They offered me the job. Can you imagine? That sounds kind of strange. They offered me the job too soon. They didn't give me a chance for me to demonstrate to them all the things that I can do. I thought that was a very interesting kind of scenario. And it just goes back to this idea that there are certain individuals who see themselves as quite unique. You need to allow them sufficient time to demonstrate this uniqueness because you're going to have to deal with their expectations later on. I would now sort of start to wrap up by highlighting some of the implications and conclusions and bring it all together so that we can see what sense it actually makes. Where do we go from here? I think one major conclusion was that clearly these people perceive themselves as an elite group with very rare skills. And I think this is an important issue with regard to the fact that talent is scarce. You are perceiving these people as an elite, and that brings with it certain challenges, which I'll come to a little bit later on as we wrap up. Because this debate, we're putting this debate within a global context, it's worth just offering a brief comparison with what happens elsewhere. Some of the other studies that we've come across, how do people perceive themselves? Or what is it that talented people are looking for? Some studies, for example, in the UK, say that people are looking for interesting work, right? It's not so much the caring family thing, but interesting work. Studies in South Africa talk about wanting to be part of the high-performing culture. Now you can see here there are the individuals who will be seeing themselves as wanting to be challenged by the work. That's what they want, okay? In terms of retention, what should managers be doing? What do employees, what do these talented people expect of their management? What kind of behavior do they want to see? So the South Africans will be wanting to see management with high integrity and management of high quality. That's an important retention mechanism for them. A study in India talks about fair play, relationship with and working with great people. That's what these employees are looking for. In China, notion of benevolence and managers showing that they care. This care thing comes up a lot actually. And family issues. In Hong Kong is also obviously, as I mentioned, about caring family and career advancement, and also rewards become important. So these are things that become critical for retaining these individuals. Just carrying on, we also realize that there needs to be a new way to addressing the psychological contract. Clearly, as you probably know, the psychological contract is about the tacit expectations that people bring to the table when you offer them a job, how they want to see the employment relationship unravel. Now, in this particular case, we think it's important that to go back to the drawing board, to have another understanding, a better understanding of the challenges that the psychological contract brings to the table. And where trust is essential, trust being a two-way traffic, because you want to be able to trust these individuals because you are placing a big burden on them as talented individuals, but they also expect to see some degree of reciprocity because they have an opportunity to walk out of the door if they wanted to. I would like to conclude by highlighting the notion of power, which I think is very important. I've done some work in the past prior to this study, which looked at how people acquire knowledge and how they use that knowledge to enhance their status and their employability. And I think that's a very important observation in the sense that organizations need to recognize that people have the capacity to appropriate the knowledge that they create and to use that as leverage to advance themselves. It happens all the time. I mean, even within universities, if you publish a certain number of good papers, that gives you a certain power, a certain gravitas, which you can use not just to consolidate your position in the particular employing organization, but to make yourself marketable elsewhere. So if things aren't going very well here, you can say to them, okay, I think I'm going to look at greener pastures. So that's a phenomenon that plays out because individuals have a chance to benefit from the knowledge that they are creating. Now, what we are seeing here is a situation where these management trainees, these talented individuals, are also in a position to say, you know, actually, because I'm a unique person, we're doing all these fantastic things, I can use my knowledge to get a job somewhere else. I don't need this. If they give me trouble, I'm not going to stay. Right? So that obviously puts pressure on the organization to find ways to strengthen their retention mechanisms. So the challenge, therefore, for organizations, just to conclude, is that if you're going to be using talent management as a route to develop a pool of resources, to develop employees, you've also got to be aware that it's a double-edged sword, that there's a potential for these individuals then turn around and saying, actually, there's been a breach or a violation of this new psychological contract. I don't like it here. I'm going to walk, and that places difficulties on the organization, which then has to very quickly address the situation by replacing these people or going back to the 80% that were ignored previously and start to think, okay, these are the ones that remain. Okay, what are we going to do with these people? And that's not going to be easy in the short term. So I think my final conclusion really would be that we live in a global world where there's a lot of opportunity for movement. And this movement, I think, is going to be facilitated by the opportunity that very talented individuals have and how they want to utilize this. Because in spite of the fact that there are barriers to mobility across the world from nation to nation, talent can obviously be channeled in ways that do not necessarily involve movement. People can deliver the benefit of their knowledge across borders through technology, taking us back to one of the diagrams you saw earlier. So if you're able, for example, to do some work, you could be sitting here in Hong Kong, but you're designing products, you're doing work on your laptop, but delivering the services in another country. So you're able to overcome physical employment mobility barriers. And that opens up a lot of opportunities for talent, which we already see anyway. You know, a lot of the IT firms you saw earlier, one of the diagrams you saw earlier, it's about, you know, innovative, creative people being able to deliver irrespective of where they are. So there is an opportunity there for talent to manifest itself, to benefit itself, and to make a contribution to the organizations, to the world as a whole, in spite of the physical barriers. And I think I'd like to leave it there. Thank you.